Thank you everyone for joining us today for the Glenn College Colloquium series. We're excited to not have one, but two speakers who we'll introduce in just a moment. Before we get started, I wanted to remind the audience that our culture is to allow the speaker to present for the first 30-40 minutes with only clarifying questions from the audience. Of course, the speaker may pause, ask for feedback, but we otherwise ask that you hold your more substantive questions until the end of the presentation. We truly value audience engagement and hope to have a dynamic and constructive discussion at the conclusion of the presentation. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Tran to introduce our wonderful speakers.
All right, thanks, Alan. Hello, everyone. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. Chao Guo and Dr. Viviana Wu to our Glenn College's Colloquium series today. So I myself personally have got to know Dr. Guo and Dr. Wu for a long time as part of their nonprofit organizations and voluntary action community, or the ANOVA community. And they've always been among my favorite scholars and even friends within this ANOVA community. So I'm really glad to have the chance to introduce them to you all. So Dr. Chao Guo is a professor of nonprofit management in the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests focus on the intersection between nonprofit and voluntary action and government. And more specifically, he conducts research on the contributions of nonprofits to democratic governance, collaboration within and across sectors, social entrepreneurship, and the role and effects of new media on nonprofit organizations. His research has been recognized by his peer and won many awards for many disciplines. Dr. Guo has also been actively involved in many professional and community service activities. He has, for example, served on the board of directors of ANOVA. He has served as a co-editor-in-chief of Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, or NVSQ, the premier journal in the nonprofit field. And so in 2019, he very well-deservedly received the Distinguished Achievement and Service Award from ANOVA. And Dr. Viviana Wu, she's an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy at UMass Amherst. Using mixed methods and computational approaches, she has been studying the roles and capacities of nonprofit organizations to advance public problem solving. Her research interests include philanthropy and nonprofit management, inequality and place-based disadvantage, connective action on social media, computational methods, etc. She recently was awarded a research grant from the Generosity Commission for a project on the so-called Matthew effect in generosity, which looks at the philanthropic gap across the US with a particular focus on how nonprofits that serve disadvantaged communities are affected. So that will be part of their presentation today. So we're really looking forward to the presentation. So thank you, Dr. Guo and Dr. Wu. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tran, for your kind introduction. And thank you, Dr. Stephanie Moulton, for your kind invitation. And Viviana and I it's really an honor to be here. And thank you all for attending the colloquium. I saw some friendly faces. I saw Aaron Beaton here. Hi, Aaron. Good to see you. Viviana and I have been working on and off for nearly 9 years, I believe, on various projects. But this is, believe it or not, the first time we ever co-present something together. So this is a great opportunity. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Now, please let me share the screen.
We see it now.
Can I see everything okay?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, and I should say that from my end, I can see our colleagues in the small conference room, although I cannot recognize you because I cannot see everybody clearly. But thank you so much for coming. Before we delve into the research project, I wanted to spend a couple minutes to explain how Viviana and I individually and collectively got here in this project. My first encounter with the term of Matthew effect started back in 2009 when I was working with a couple of colleagues from the University of Georgia to examine an interesting topic, the relationship between labor force migration and rural poverty. And we observed that during the recession, skilled workers would relocate from rural to urban counties to find jobs, but they don't return to the rural communities when the economy improves or recovers. So that leads to the draining of skilled workers in rural counties, while urban counties got to keep all the good workers in those communities. So that's a phenomenon we labeled as the massive effect in labor force migration. At that time, our idea was to propose that a vibrant nonprofit sector would be able to mitigate the massive effect by keeping the labor force in their own communities and reducing the outflow of skilled workers from the rural counties. That project never got kicked off. We had a proposal, we never really got funded, and we never really started on the project. But one question kept haunting me as time went on. That was, we had this assumption that the nonprofit sector would be able to play that role of mitigating the massive effect. But what if the sector itself also suffers from the same kind of massive effect? That is, the nonprofit sector in certain counties suffer from systematic lack of resources and infrastructure to do an effective job. So we had this question in mind as the time went on. We never really got, I never really got into the in-depth analysis of the issue. Then 10 years passed. When I was writing a book on nonprofit advocacy in the social media age, my co-author Greg Saxon and I revisited that issue, and we labeled it as the resource challenge for the nonprofit sector. And the resource challenge refers to the increasing concentration of resources, financial and volunteer and other resources, within a small number of nonprofit organizations, while the majority of smaller nonprofits suffer from the lack of resources. So in a way, it's a massive effect at the nonprofit sector level. And amazingly and independently, Viviana started looking at the same set of issues when she started her doctoral study at Penn. As part of her dissertation, she examined the relationship between place-based inequality and community philanthropy. She coined the term place dilemma to describe an awkward situation that many community foundations found themselves in. That is, community foundations in those communities where the social issues and demands are most pressing. Unfortunately, happen to be those foundations to be in those communities where the resources are most lacking. So we have this dilemma where on the one hand, you have increasing demand, but on the other hand, you have a tremendous lack of resources. She continued on this journey and in her dissertation, as well as some extension of her dissertation work in this publication in Voluntas, where she presented a community assessment model and empirical evidence of what factors affect the growth of community foundations in certain communities, but not in others. So all these prior studies that we have done individually and collectively led us to where we are today. But I should mention from the very beginning that Viviana has been the driver of this particular project. After graduation, after she finished her dissertation work and whatnot, she just couldn't get rid of this particular question, and she wanted to further explore it. And we worked together to implement, to continue our journey on this particular research question. With this project, which is very much a work in progress, we're hoping to take advantage of the population level nonprofit data and the census data to really trace the patterns of philanthropic giving to nonprofit sectors across communities and time. So that was our general idea behind this working project. And we invited Jima from the University of Texas, Austin to join us on this project so that we can benefit from his critical thinking and his experience working with large data sets. On this slide, we're going to share our research question, which I already kind of summarized in the previous slide. But do something unusual. We're going to preview some of the key takeaways of our study so that you'll know what's going to happen at the end of our presentation. So our study have found the following. The bad news is that we actually have provided some evidence for the existence of a Matthew effect, which is the self-reinforcing process that serves to reproduce the inequality in philanthropic capacities across communities. But it's not all bad news. We also have good news as well. The good news is government actually plays a good role. Government support to the local nonprofit sector plays an instrumental role in curbing the Matthew effect. But there's also the puzzle. The puzzle is, although we have documented the positive role overall for government support, the message is not across the board. We see that government support seems to be more effective in curbing the Matthew effect in certain communities than others, in certain contexts, but perhaps making things even worse in some other contexts. So keep the bad, the good, and the puzzle in mind as we continue with listening to our presentation. In the next two slides, we're going to present the theoretical framework of our study. It really has two components. It has two parts. The first part is, not surprisingly, the Matthew effect. We hope to offer a framework that can help us understand what are the community level disadvantages that serve to decrease the capacity for local nonprofit organizations to attract resources from the community. And for the empirical analysis, we focused on the financial resources, that is donations to the local nonprofit sector. But you could, theoretically, the resources can include volunteer resources and other in-kind resources as well. So we have identified 3 types of community disadvantages. Socioeconomic disadvantage mainly refers to the economic strengths of a particular local community. The kind of resources, economic resources the community holds in terms of the SES status of the community. And then we look at the minority disadvantage. That is the extent to which a community is racial minority prominent, which we in particular identify as having 1/3 or more minority population in a particular community. And then the rural disadvantage. We argue that the fact that your community is located in a rural area will have some negative impact on your ability to attract resources to the nonprofit sector. So we have identified those 3 types of community level disadvantages that we believe will lead to the reduced level of philanthropic resources in a particular local nonprofit sector. So that taken together lead to a self-sustaining issue in the cross community. That is the Matthew effect. That is, some communities tend to communicate more resources, but other communities suffer from the lack of resources. So we have heard the bad news. Now, what solutions do we have? And what solutions have been out there? Naturally, we look at the role of the government. And in our theoretical framework, we identify the role of the government in 2 ways. The first is the direct effect. We argue that government support to the local nonprofit sector would serve to increase the ability of nonprofit organizations to attract financial resources of donations in in a given community. So that's a direct effect. But indirectly, we also look at the moderating effect that government support has on the negative impact of the three types of socioeconomic, minority, and rural disadvantages on philanthropic capacity. Consistent with this theoretical framework, we have developed the two sets of hypotheses. The first hypothesis refers to the socioeconomic disadvantage. As you can see from this the statement, this hypothesis is not totally surprising, because we know that for those communities who suffer from a low socioeconomic status tend to have fewer, less resources to support the nonprofit sector. So it's not a surprise that we make this prediction. And it has tremendous empirical support for this argument. At the individual level, we know that the ability of and motivation of a donor to make donations really depends on his or her own income, in terms of the income and also the wealth that they have in the household. So at the individual level, we see this pattern. But when we look at the community aggregated level in the community, we predict the same kind of pattern. Minority disadvantage is less clear. For one, the challenge of minority prominent communities is often associated with the low income, poverty, unemployment, and many other social challenges that the communities confront. So we have to be able to single out the other factors before we can really look into the particular advantage that we have in mind, that is the minority prominence the community and how that affects their ability to attract donations. As you can see, the first hypothesis was mainly focused on the resources that you have, the economic resources that you have in the community. And that has already been controlled for. The minority disadvantage in our mind goes beyond the economic resources that the minority population has in a particular community. We look more on the lack of social support structures and infrastructures that allow individuals in the minority groups to make donations and to support local nonprofit work. So in a way, the first hypothesis has focused on resources or the endowments, while the second hypothesis is more focused on the lack of infrastructure and support network. Rural disadvantage, which is our third hypothesis, is reflected. We argue in the same way as we argue for minority disadvantage, although we argue that in rural communities there are certain lack of infrastructures and the support system that also affect the way that people make donation to the local nonprofit sector. But we argue that the rural disadvantage and a minority disadvantage are distinct effects that should be treated isolatedly or separately. So these are the three hypotheses associated with the Matthew effect. Then turning to the role of the government, we argue that first, the direct effect. Government support is positively associated with philanthropic capacity. That is, the ability for the local nonprofit sector to attract donations to support their work. There is some literature that discuss whether government support to the local nonprofit sector has a crowd-in effect or crowd-out effect. So the message is not coherent. There are the findings are mixed. For the purpose of our argument, we argue that the crowd-in effect would dominate the process. That is, government support, when government support increases its support to the local nonprofit sector, it serves to increase the capacity of the local nonprofit organization. They have more resources from the government, so they can hire more skilled workers. They can provide more. They are able to serve more people and establish a better track record, which in turn to attract people to make more donations to the local nonprofit sector. And keep in mind that we have all this discussion under the condition that the other factors have already been controlled for. So this complementary effect that government support has, in addition to the local, the social economic status of the community and how that affects the philanthropic capacity of the community. Hypothesis 5 is less well developed. We have pretty solid arguments for all the hypotheses that we have presented so far, but hypothesis 5 is interesting. We sense the government support, in addition to the direct effect, would also moderate the negative effects of socioeconomic minority and rural disadvantages on the philanthropic capacity of local nonprofits. But the exact mechanism, how that work, remain unclear. We have discussed several possibilities. We have looked into the each of the hypotheses, but we're still developing these arguments. But our overall prediction, I just throw it out here for you to think about, is that we argue that government support would actually mitigate the negative impact of all three types of disadvantages. So that was our prediction. And later, Viviana will show you, to what extent that prediction is supported. Okay, so that's the framework and the hypothesis of the study. I'm turning over to the presentation to Viviana, who will share the methods, data, and results.
Thank you so much, Chao. As Chao mentioned, we are still working towards completing the first draft and thinking through some of the analysis. So we really welcome your feedback and suggestions towards our presentation and our working paper. And to answer our research questions, let's dive into our empirical strategy. Our strategy involves combining several large data sets from the business master files to get the overall set of the nonprofits in the community. We also harvested the nonprofit 990 data from NCCS as well as the Amazon Web Service, where they host the e-filing in the past in terms of financial variables. So they have changed the way they host it, as many of you may have aware. But anyway, for this project, we are lucky to have been able to harvest 20 years of data for the nonprofit sector. We also have combined some census data like American Community Survey, small area income and poverty statistics, as well as the rural urban continuum codes, etc. So that we are able to look at both the philanthropic capacity as well as the various disadvantages and their impacts on the philanthropic capacity. While since we're looking at inequality and philanthropic capacity across communities, the level of analysis we are looking at is at the county level across for 20 years. in terms of the descriptive analysis. However, for our regressional analysis, we need to restrict to 2014 to 2019. The reasons is because the government grants variable could only be retrieved from the AWS e-filing data. So that really limited our analysis, but we still have around 18,000 county observations in the regression analysis. As later I will describe, we have done a fixed effects controlling for the state fixed effect and the year fixed effect in doing this longitudinal analysis. And before we jump into that, we do need to look at some of the measures so that you understand what we are doing here. And Chao, take the next slide. Thank you. Yep. And in terms of the philanthropic capacity, we look at the total private giving at the county level. So we deducted the government grants from the total contributions, which we can find from the 990 form, so that the contribution will only include giving, which could be from individuals or foundations, but we take out the public grant, the government grant part. So that would be the private giving. In terms of the descriptive analysis, we have also included the end of year asset size so that it can give us a better understanding of the size of the nonprofit sector. And in terms of the poverty, in terms of the socioeconomic disadvantage, next.
Cool.
Yep. Right. Thank you. Yeah. In terms of socioeconomic disadvantage, we use for the current preliminary analysis, we use poverty rate as a very rough measure. We are also thinking about using other index measure as we look into the sociological research. There's a different way to capture socioeconomic disadvantage. We will welcome your feedback and suggestion if you have any good ones. We are definitely also analyzing other ways to understand that. But poverty rate right now is the most direct measure for looking at the socioeconomic disadvantage. As Chao mentioned, in terms of minority disadvantage, we use a dummy variable, the dummy measure to categorize whether that community is minority prominent or not. And that measure was captured by whether the minority population, meaning the non-white population, is more than 1/3 of the county population. And the rural disadvantage, we also use a dummy measure based on the rural-urban continuum code. So we distinguish whether they are rural community or the urban community. And lastly, for the moderator, we use government grants, which is a continuous measure, and we control for other variables that could be a confounding factors, such as program service revenue, fundraising cost, county population, nonprofit density, etc. And when we turn to the descriptive results, we would really want to show you some of the overall trend, particularly the philanthropic trajectories over 20 years. So since there's a lot of rich data here, we may not be able to delve into each single changes, but if you see any interesting patterns, feel free to tell us what you see there. So first of all, in this line graph, we can see the overall trend of the philanthropic trajectory. The blue line indicates the number of nonprofits over 20 years. And the green line indicates the average contributions. And as you can see, there's a general upward trend along 20 years. However, we find that there is a major dip from 2015 to around 2018 when they are stagnant. We are still thinking about what's going on there because that was not the 2008 financial crisis, but that is what we have found. And that is in terms of the county aggregated data. And the next one is the spatial. So besides looking at the longitudinal trend, we also look at the spatial trend. And these two colopleth maps visualize the highest state level giving per 1,000 population in 2014, which is in orange, and 2019, which is in purple. And the darker color indicates highest giving, meaning the more generous state. And the pattern, as you can see, pretty similar, right? The darker color, you can see that New York State, Georgia, and Texas, and California seems to be amongst the most generous states. And if you look at the table on your right, you can see that Cook County, Illinois, DC, and New York County are the most generous county. And just a brief note, in terms of gathering the data, we did not discount any huge international nonprofit here. So that is really the raw data. So you may wonder why they have, some of the county may have more, which may not be, coherent to what we have perceived and we have think before. And looking at by various statistics, we found that poverty rate, which measures socioeconomic disadvantage, is negatively associated with philanthropic capacity, as we can see from the negative correlation as displayed on the y-axis. Similarly, if we look at median household income, and you can see that the orange line indicate community which are the most affluent, which is at the top, above 25% income, and the bottom blue line indicates communities where it is below 25%. And this is really the philanthropic gap between the richer community and the poor community. And as you can see, this also indicates that income as a measure or proxy for socioeconomic disadvantage is also negatively correlated with the philanthropic capacity, which provides some preliminary support to our first hypothesis. And interestingly, turning to minority disadvantage, as we mentioned, we measure by minority prominence. The trend seems to be reversed, which is contradictory to what we expected and contrary to what we find from the literature, right? The orange line actually denotes the minority prominent community. The blue line indicates the white dominance community. It means that, well, the white dominant communities seem to have much lower philanthropic capacity than minority dominance community. While this graph may not support our initial hypothesis, it did not contain control for other confounding factors such as urbanity. So that could be one of the reasons why the patterns reversed. And now let's turn to the urban and rural philanthropic gap. And as you can see from this slide graph, rural communities had very little contribution over the year. It's almost negligible at the bottom. However, the urban community have much higher, even though it's fluctuating, but it's still much higher than rural communities. And that stark contrast remains significant in our regression analysis, as we later discuss. And lastly, no more graph later. Lastly, it is a government grants. So it has a positive correlation, which you can see from the y-axis, both for giving and assets size. So that's also provide initial support to our hypothesis. And now let's dive into the regression analysis, where Chao mentioned the good, the bad, and the puzzle. Without boring you with the number, let me just quickly give you what we did, tell you what we did here. So we do fixed effect regression model that control for the year and state fixed effect for, particularly we are looking into the human service subsector, human service nonprofit subsector, as it closely related to government support and our hypothesis. The first model provide the main effect, which means you do not have interaction effect. And then from model 2 to model 5, we added individual interaction term to the model and see how that changes. And model 5, which is the last model, included all the interaction effect. And if you are so smart and you're able to also look into all the numbers, you can see that the patterns are quite similar. The direction are very similar, and the significance as well. And let me give you a quick summary of the findings. And without ruining the surprise, which we already did, just wider, is that all three disadvantages, as you can see from the first model, reduce philanthropic capacity over time. They both have a negative and significant beta coefficient. And following the complementary perspective, government support actually increases philanthropic capacity over time across all the models. So that really give the support and evidence to the Matthew effect and the role of government. Now turning to the moderating effect, as there is a graph we are looking at, the effect from government support in mitigating those disadvantages. We find that government grant indeed moderate at least two of the disadvantages. First, the socioeconomic disadvantage, it has a positive coefficient, and which is a significant one too. That means as the government funding increases in a community, the negative effect of socioeconomic disadvantage on philanthropic capacity diminishes. The way that we think about it, as Chao mentioned, we are still working on conceptualizing, and we indeed have conceptualized some of the explanations. One of them was actually that because government have invested a lot in the public welfare infrastructures as well as the nonprofit safety nets, right? And as they have invested and provided support to the sector, it also helped improving the socioeconomic environment of that community. Hence, that may help mitigate those negative effects and stimulate philanthropy in those poor communities. Well, surprisingly, that effect does not occur similarly on minority disadvantage. The coefficient was not significant, even though it's positive. It means that while government funding increases, the negative effect seems to remain somewhat unchanged. That means that minority disadvantage may not be able to be curbed by government support in that way. What's the most alarming and complex story, which could also be making sense, is that the negative effect of rural disadvantage actually is worsened. In other words, that means as government funding increases, the rural and urban philanthropic gap widens even more significantly. We had the interaction graph for those that are interested in looking at it. Essentially, government support seems to be more readily stimulate the giving to urban nonprofits than to rural nonprofits. And that may be related to how the rural giving is situated, right? They may not be that closely correlated with government support. They may be more closely correlated or supported by social capital in the rural communities. They may rely on churches, families, etc., and may not receive, unfortunately, that much amount of public support towards rural welfare state. And there's a bunch of literature on rural problems. However, we found very little in terms of literature review that could really talk about rural giving. So if you're interested in this area, I would encourage you pursuing this topic together. I think it is such an important topic that could not be missed out. And with that, I wanted to turn to Chao to wrap up our presentation and leads us to the discussion.
Thank you, Viviana. Now you see the slide. I have decided actually to stop share because I want to see everybody's faces when we continue the discussion. So why is this study important? For those of you who are familiar with the nonprofit literature, you might recall that Lester Salomon many years ago developed this theory called voluntary sector failure theory or voluntary failure theory. And it basically says that one important source of voluntary failure is that if the nonprofit voluntary sector does not have the resources or capacity to actually do an effective job addressing many of the social issues in the community. And that becomes a reason for government intervention. So you may ask, okay, we have Lester Salomon's voluntary failure theory, so why this Matthew effect discussion? Well, we believe that our argument is qualitatively different from Lester Salomon's argument in that Lester Salomon's argument is focused on the overall capacity issue for the nonprofit sector, while our study is focused on the unequal distribution of resources across communities. So the focus is quite different. But it does, in many ways, raise an issue of how and in what ways government can do a more effective job in addressing the issues in conjunction with the work of voluntary sector and also the private sector as well, which we didn't include in our study. But I do want to recognize that in order to address many of the social issues in our community, we need all three sectors to get together. And our study doesn't not include that the private sector part of the story, but it's important to recognize that. With that, what we have found, as Viviana has already documented in the data analysis, and also as we previewed and at the very beginning, there's the good, the bad, and the puzzle. Right. The good news, the bad news is that we did provide evidence for the existence of a massive effect. We found that the philanthropic capacity of the nonprofit sector is lower in disadvantaged communities. Disadvantaged being in terms of poor, being in poor, minority, prominent, or rural communities. So that's the bad news. But the good news is, despite many criticism of government and how bad it can be sometimes, government seems to be doing its job, at least to much extent in this particular context. We find that government plays a significant role in mitigating the massive effect. But the picture is not crystal clear. That's where the puzzle comes in, right? We find, as Viviana already mentioned, for some reasons, the government wasn't able to make an impact on the negative effect of minority disadvantage. Or in the case of a rural disadvantage, it actually makes things even worse. So what's exactly going on in those contexts? That's something that we are still investigating, and that's something we hope to get your advice on. With that, I think we're ready for questions and answers.
Great, Chao, thank you. I'd like to open it up to doctoral students first, actually. So if there are any doctoral students in the room or on the call, or other students that would like to start with a question, that would be great.
Aaron, and then Caroline.
I was giving some applause, and I definitely have some comments and questions. Are there any doctoral students that want to jump in first? Maham?
Thank you, Dr. Guo and Dr. Wu, for a wonderful presentation. I have two questions which are a little bit related, but I'm a second-year doctoral student here studying nonprofit organizations. Recently just presented at Arnova, which was awesome. And my research interests actually currently are focused on social media use and adoption by nonprofit organizations post-George Floyd. So looking at and tracking the social justice movement and language in nonprofit organizations after some of these events. And so my question about the Matthew effect is a little bit related, where I'm curious on if you think that the Matthew effect would hold in the area of internet adoption and nonprofit organizations. So like, do you expect that the gap is actually wider for organizations that are not on social media versus those that are on social media and able to use it for fundraising capacity or other identity promoting activities? So I think essentially I'm asking is like internet adoption or internet use may be another moderating or mediating effect.
Maham, that's a great suggestion. First of all, congratulations on the first presentation, Aranova. That sounds awesome.
Thank you.
And in response to your comment, Viviana, you can chime in anytime. I agree. I agree the technology could play a role, could make things worse for some organizations and make things better for other organizations. So yes, the digital divide could very well be a source of this massive effect as well. We, given the data set we have, we do not have the data to test this, but I do agree that down the road we could design another study that take into account this the technological divide, the digital divide. Thank you.
Thank you.
Charity?
Hi, thank you both for this really interesting presentation. I just have a question. Did you limit the type of philanthropic organizations that you were looking at? So just like welfare organizations versus, because I know there's a huge gap between like arts, philanthropic organizations and others. And if you found any differences in like the type of organizations, rural versus urban?
Chao, do you want me to take it?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Charity. This is excellent questions. So in terms of the descriptive analysis for 20 years of the data, we actually presented the overall sector. So we didn't distinguish it, but we did try to distinguish it in particular for the regression model. And as we delve in the data, we realized that the subsector really matters. Right, we talk a lot about nonprofit sectors and sector differences, but the subsector differences actually matters a lot, given the history, the policy effect on those subsectors. So essentially, we are also contemplating maybe limiting our entire analysis to human service organization, as we today just presented for the regression result. Because as you mentioned, the art and cultural nonprofits, they have different drivers, right? Talk about elite giving and talking about other giving and particularly government roles in terms of on the human service subsector. So we are definitely taking advice in doing that. And that really sounds that's really echoing. Thank you.
And to piggyback on Viviana's comments, this is a fascinating question because it suggests that in addition to the overall flow of resources to certain communities versus others, even in a given community, for instance, the resources might be flowing into certain sectors that serve to reinforce the status quo instead of those organizations that address the poverty and inequality issues. Excellent, thank you.
Great. No other students? Then we'll go. Oh yeah, oh no. We'll go to Caroline, and then there's some over in the room, and then put your hand up on Zoom if you have a question too. We'll get to you in turn. Or comment.
Hi, thank you. Thank you to the organizers and also to our guests, Caroline Wagner, professor at the Glenn College. I wanted to make an observation, and then perhaps the question is, have you thought of this? So, and the reason I bring it up is I study the Matthew effect in research funding. So, which you may know is where Matthew effect got started, right? It was originally proposed by Robert Merton as part of trying to understand why in research, people who are researching, once they get some resources, they get more resources, right? So the Matthew effect there. Right. And one of the things that we look at in research funding is indeed the Matthew effect occurs when government is funding research, that you see that there is a reputation effect involved. When people are well known, they are more likely to get funded. However, I would like to offer this observation in reference to your study, and that is that anytime you get government funding involved, you have to have public accountability. And so if you have public accountability as part of government funding, it actually answers your puzzle, because funding to the minority or rural areas is going to be less likely to get attention and have impact or be easily related to impact measurements, which is exactly the same as we see in research, that in research funding, researchers who get money, who already have big labs, who already have lots of students, who are already well known, are going to get more or have more ability to show the impact. And so I would suggest that the introduction of government funding is exactly what you would expect, that in fact, as you get government funding, the focus now on impact and accountability is going to in fact result in exactly what you show. So if you're interested in knowing more about the research on research accountability, I'd also be happy to point you in those directions. Thank you.
No, that'll be great. Thank you so much, Caroline. This is very helpful, and it helps us understand the puzzles, because we have been scratching our heads and you're thinking about why exactly that that happened. So yes, it would be great if you could direct us to those readings that we could learn more about the Matthew effect in research funding. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caroline.
Jennifer. Yeah, thank you for the excellent talk. Very interesting. I do work primarily in rural food security interventions and policies, but of course that intersects with the nonprofit sector. So I'm not a nonprofit sector, but I'm learning more every day from colleagues here. And I'm wondering, related to our own research in Southeastern Ohio, which is rural, I wonder, as you define and operationalize philanthropic capacity, is there any capacity in your data sets to define it not just by donations, but also like volunteer capacity and kind of getting at what you were saying earlier about the social networks? Because I know, what we've observed just kind of anecdotally in some of our work is that volunteer capacity varies widely, and a community that is less likely to have donors is perhaps also less likely to have people who have that disposable time and who have less of a need to have uncompensated income, which I think a lot of nonprofits rely on. So I was wondering if, that was kind of the first part of my question. I was wondering, to what degree can you incorporate that in your analysis?
Excellent. Viviana, you want to take this question?
Thank you for the question. It is excellent. I think, and I think what our current working paper is limited in terms of we are using monetizing philanthropic capacity, meaning we are just capturing the contributions, which is just a partial picture, right? And volunteer, as I recall, one of the feedback I've got was that in the rural communities, everyone's know everyone, and they may not need all that giving, but they may need help. And volunteer motivation and volunteer resources could be one of the major philanthropic resources that nonprofit relies on. So I think that definitely is an important point. And that's why I have been persuading Chao and shall we look at the number of volunteers, right? As well as the staff members in that nonprofit, right? In the nonprofit. And that potentially might help see minimizing the rural and urban gap. And I think this is an excellent observations. I think in terms of the measures, I've been thinking about the number of volunteers, the number of employees, and maybe the board member as well, as they are also the human resources, which also potentially the philanthropic resources of the rural nonprofits. And
Right.
If you have any suggestions, and we're welcome to hear that too.
And Viviana, do we have such data in our data sets?
According to he said no. He said you have to recollect everything again. But I think it's such an important, this is like the third time I've heard of this advice. And that really gave us a sounding call. And I think this is something that we should look at. Maybe we partner with one of the scholar here, and then we can look at the volunteering pieces of that question. Unfortunately, I might have to run to a faculty meeting at UMass. So I have to apologize to miss out such an interesting and stimulating discussions. But I know Chao and I will be happy to stay connected with you all, even though I have to drop off on the call now. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr.
And I'm staying. Don't worry, I'm not leaving.
Right.
Thank you, Viviana. Yeah. To
Nice to
piggyback
see you
on the question, I think it's such an important observation that in addition to financial resources, we should look at some non-in-kind resources such as volunteer work. At the individual level, I did a couple of studies in the past that look at the giving and volunteering behavior of low-income people, especially welfare recipients. And the findings are actually inspiring. So we find that although people who receive public assistance do not donate as much as their counterparts, they tend to volunteer more, at least in certain contexts. So the role of volunteering and volunteer work and how does it affect the massive effect is an important topic. Thank you.
Karen?
Thanks, Chao, for this great presentation. I think the idea of looking at volunteering is really interesting. Of course, the problem is always the difference between informal and formal volunteering, and being able to capture in those minority communities, especially some of that informal volunteering. I had two things that I thought might be sort of helpful. One is more of a comment building on Caroline's question. I know that you're looking for some thoughts on this puzzle aspect. For me, when you were presenting that that hypothesis, it seemed to have sort of an underlying assumption that the government will equitably distribute their funding, right? And that's a pillar in PA, and we would hope that they are sort of equitable in that fashion. But I think that there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that it wouldn't be very equitable in how it's being distributed. Different from equal, right? We would hope that they would be, especially in the human services case. I think Charity brought up this question of different subsectors. I think specifically in human services, we would hope that the government is helping to do something to rebalance the funding, but it seems like they're not. And I think that's a really important finding. My question was really, it was more of a methodological question. I just wondered, I didn't see GDP addressed within the model, and I know that that's a pretty big indicator of giving. So I wondered how you were thinking about that, and also about transformation of the dependent variable, which is pretty common in these types of studies, to look at giving per capita or maybe per GDP or something like that, that might equal out some of the differences that you're seeing. Especially this urban rural one seems like a very big one that could be maybe controlling for population just isn't quite enough, and there might need to be some other considerations there. Not that I don't believe that there would be differences between urban and rural based on how government funding is allocated, but just wondered if some of those methodological things might be part of the issue there.
Well, thank you, Aaron. These are great suggestions. We have experimented with some additional measures for the socioeconomic disadvantage that a community has, and overall, I don't remember exactly. I wish Viviana or Gia was here. We included GDP, but we did include a number of measures, and we're thinking down the road that we would create a composite measure that combines all these measures together. But we could simply just use alternative measure and see if the patterns still hold. But that's a great suggestion. And speaking of the transformation of the dependent variable, I think that's a great suggestion as well. It's something that we usually should do, and given feedback from this audience and also from our prior interactions. We should do that, and we will do it down the road. But I think that's an important suggestion.
Great.
Well, yeah, all quick. Those Raskels, I'm a professor here at the college. Is there variation between cities when it comes to the research that you do, as in poor, lower income cities and very wealthy cities? You just contrast a city in Mississippi with, say, Burlington, Vermont. Because I could imagine that rural urban is too big, too big a difference. There must be variation in your cities.
Right.
Is that the case? And I asked this because I was thinking during your talk about Italy, how that for 5 centuries now has had major differences, even in cities, if you compare the south to the north. Now, yeah,
that's a great question. We had a similar discussion at one point during the data analysis in the past couple of months about how we can provide a more refined analysis, or maybe a subsample analysis, and look at the cities instead of kind of the simple urban-rural distinction, which is just too broad a brush to show patterns. And looking at cities or the major urban centers and how that patterns hold would be very, very interesting to explore. And I believe we can do. I believe the data and the analytical techniques allow should allow us to do that. Of course, it's easier for me to say because it's the G and Viviana who are doing the empirical work. But as yeah, I agree. I will make a note of it. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, we're at noon. I think I have some more comments and questions, but I'll send them by email. And if others have thoughts or comments, please send them to Chao. But and Chao, I think you're willing to stick around and talk with the doctoral students. Is that
Yes,
right?
I'm happy to.
That would be wonderful. That would be great. So if doctoral students want to stick around for a few minutes and get a chance to talk to Dr. Guo, then we'll do that. So thank you so much. It's a great presentation. Very thoughtful.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed it. I know Viviana must have felt the same way. This is just a great opportunity for us to present our work and exchange ideas with you all. Thank you so much.